Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Gwen Ellen. Let me get used to this microphone a little bit and get here. I would add to Tom's introduction that the Taklamakan Desert is part of the Gobi Desert, and it means, apparently, someone told me, goes out, does not come back. So avoid places with the name Taklamakan, just in general. Well, I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I heard you had a great session this morning. Got into biology. There's some biology going on here, so we'll hope to make a few links. But I want to say how delighted I am to be able to do what I'm doing today, because I've always thought about doing it and never had the opportunity. Mostly when you're a writer and you read a novel or something, your publisher wants you to set up, or they set up things with bookstores like Powell's or Annie Bloom's, or fairly recently at the Book Bin downtown here last Friday. There was a great event. By the way, if you're not a fan of the Book Bin downtown, they have wonderful stuff going on there, and you can go in there and give them your email address, and they'll put you on a list of authors who are appearing and various kinds of events there. And I'm a great fan of the Book Bin. It's our own little Powell's that we have here. So mostly they want you to go to a book place and read from your book, and then talk about it a little bit, and then take questions, usually about the craft of writing and things like that. And it's kind of the same thing. I had an acquaintance. In fact, the guy, Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote The Fight Club, and he got so, when that book got very famous, he had done so many of these that after a while he started to make balloon animals to go along with it. And I suggested to Tom, maybe I should throw some balloon animals in today. And he said, no, we have a strict policy against balloon animals for this. But I would like to take you on an adventure then, that is, how does this stuff get written? There's a blank page, and there's this head, and there's other things I think about, and newspaper articles and various kinds of things. But how does that blank page get filled up? What happens? What's the creative process? So what I want to do today is to kind of take you along on kind of an odyssey, a journey, an anatomy of the creative process. How this stuff gets done. I mean, part of what I did in this new novel is a novel I could not have written 5 years ago. And I couldn't certainly have written it 10 years ago. And it's a novel of my later years, let's call it. It's a novel of the later years, and I don't think it would have been possible with those other times. And I think you'll see why. So what I want to do today is to talk in 5 parts, kind of a 5-part movement here. Let me get my notes up here. I want to go along on and talk about a couple of things that came together that produced this novel. One of them, for example, the first one is, I don't know if you know what fractals are. We'll have a lot of pictures of fractals. We even talk about it. If you want somebody to do the math on it, you know my academic background. You won't get it from me, but the internet's full of the math on the fractals. It's really kind of interesting stuff. Reiterations, coming back. Fractals are designs, but they are number sequences, and they are you want this closer? Is this okay? All right. Tighter? Yeah. Okay, so the fractals, I want to start out with fractals. I ran into fractals, and in fact, some of you may know the math professor Junpei Sekino, who's been retired for a while now, but he comes from an artistic family. His father was a national treasure in Japan, made beautiful prints. Junpei was a part of that tradition, but he became a math professor and taught it for many years. So he did the math and the design part. We'll talk about fractals. I ran into fractals after my retirement, and I thought about them, and they connected up with some other things. So we'll start out talking a little bit about fractals. The second movement will be something that's been with me all the time in my career, which is because of what I did. I taught American Studies, and American Studies is not strictly just literature, but it's literature in an interdisciplinary sense, in that the piece is, it's literature, but history and economics and architecture and art and sculpture and everything that's going around, how all these things talk to each other. And so it's it's that interdisciplinary sense led me to often talking about things in the 20th century, such as modernism. Now, modernism is a word you've run into in lots of ways. There is the modern, there's modernism in architecture, modernism of all sorts. And I want to talk a little bit about the extension of modernism in literature and a few other things and how those all come together. And I hope how they start to chatter in my head to the idea of fractals and the reiterative nature of fractals and mathematics. And those are two of the ingredients in the recipe, if you like, and how they came together. And the third ingredient, I want to talk a little bit about AI, or artificial intelligence, and its different kinds of versions. And we'll talk about it a little bit later. Anybody have a Roomba here? Do those work? Do they work? They do work, yeah. Okay, I promised my wife a Roomba, right? And I said, it'll drive around, it'll plug itself in and charge itself up and vacuum the floor. But you know, smartphones and smart cars and all the other kinds of smart devices that are available. And AI, the whole AI idea is often thought about in terms of chips, silicon chips, various kinds of mechanical things. But there's another whole kind of AI that's going on out there. Kind of AI, what one guy from Intel called the meat chip. And the meat chip is essentially spit in the cup here next to your computer, and you will have all the, if you like, all the architecture necessary to produce all the memory you need. And this is not available yet with the spit cup. But AI is interesting because it combines in Star Trek ways people and machines, and it's part of my whole book on it. So the AI, and then finally there's a section on hearing voices. Now, if I look around this room, statistically, between 3 and 10% of you hear pretty clear voices. And I'm just talking statistically. And these are non-psychologically debilitating voices. This is not the pathology of psychosis or schizophrenia. And that's just another thing. But purely the fact that people do hear voices. In fact, there's one guy named James who says that 3,000 years ago, almost everybody heard voices. He was the guy who postulated the chambers of the brain and that we had a different brain 4,000 years ago. People heard voices. But again, statistically, between 3 and 10% of you hear pretty clear voices. And if we extend that to simply hearing your name called, looking around and not finding someone there, then 75% of you have heard this. So this hearing voices, and we'll talk about it a little later, the Hearing Voices Network. So can you see where we're going here? We got the fractals, and we have modernism, and what is modernism, and what is the modern tenor, with the essential idea behind it of make it new. Make it new is that what Ezra Pound said, this is modernism. There's a long definition too, but the short definition is reject all that stuff in the past. I want to talk a little bit about that later. So fractals and modernism and this sense of hearing voices and artificial intelligence, and these are all kind of clattering around in a lot of this stuff. Modernism I've been carrying around for a long time, 40 years of teaching, including Faulkner and James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and the great modernists. Teaching about architecture and the coming of modern architecture from about 1900 on in the building of architecture. I didn't get into music, but it would have been, you can know what happens in music, atonality, various kinds of things. In a sense, modernism is also that rich discursive soup. And by discursive soup, I mean that it invites so many discussions. Something that's discursive invites discussions on all sides. And so there are all kinds of different definitions of what modernism is in very technical terms. And I think these things come together. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about just the plain idiosyncratic experience of how how these things get assembled in your head, how this works, at least for me, how that works, how these things begin to talk to each other. And pretty soon I'm looking for a way to put them together. I'm looking for a way to put them together on some kind of hang them from a clothesline. I'm looking for some scaffolding on which to put these things. And of course, one of those ways of talking about that, especially in fiction, is called a plot. I mean, how do you make this stuff work? How do you make this stuff talk to each other? Because there they are in my brain going blah, blah, blah. Over here, and then went over there, and then there's another thing, and then I've been attending some math lectures on Thursdays. Maybe some of you attend those. And all this blah, blah, blah. How do you harness this business and turn it into fiction? Okay. Another thing I wanted to say before we're going, and it's going to be thematic. It'll be thematic for the whole business here. Is I had taped to my door for 30 years a tiny little thing I found in a magazine somewhere from John Barth. John Barth is Giles Goat Boy and a really good modern novelist. One of the fastest talking, smartest people I ever had dinner with one time at the University of Oregon. An amazing guy. And he contended, and I had this taped to my door, so I walked in every day and saw it. The world is richer in associations than it is in meanings. And we're going to keep coming back to that, because what I'm talking about here is the associations of this business that I put together here. It is richer in associations than meanings, than that clear cut, it means this. One of the classics is this, and I'll talk more about this later, but William Faulkner wrote a book called The Sound and the Fury. It's the fury part is trying to read the damn thing. If in case any of you have tangled with it, it's a tale told by an idiot. And if you and I, it's in four pieces, and if you and I were going to tell this story, we would have the other people tell the story first, and maybe the idiot tell it at the end. But no, Faulkner has the idiot tell it first, and then we find out that that's not a bad rendition of the world. But someone asked him in an interview, some student asked him one time and said, well, why did you set it at Easter? And he said, well, you know, if you're a Southern Baptist, Easter comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of freight. There it is. There's salvation. There is sacrifice. There is the daffodils. There's the coming of spring. There's rebirth there. And it all comes as a package. And he said, all you have to do is set a story, and that stuff is already there. That association is there. It's already loaded in. And it comes in a Baptist version, and it comes in a Presbyterian version, comes in a Catholic version, whatever version you want. And sometimes I do writing exercises for classes when I teach creative writing, and I have students write a scene. And I say, okay, now take about 10 minutes and set it at Halloween. And Halloween, of course, has got a bunch of stuff. It's got a bunch of business going on there that you can do. Set it at Christmas. Set it at a kind of a coming into Christmas with the family coming back. Set it at various times, and you get this load of associations, this business of associations. And the creative process is that load of associations that we keep coming back to. That's why I want to keep reiterating. I will come back to this idea. The world is richer in associations than it is in meaning. And that's a kind of a judgment. It's a judgment, but I don't know. I was so puzzled and delighted by it. Taped to my door, I walked in every day and said, okay, here we go. Teach some classes and make it richer in associations. We'll work on the meetings later. Okay. I also want to talk a little bit, if we get there towards the end. I'm shooting for... Yeah, about 45 minutes-ish. Yeah, okay. So I want to talk a little bit, too, about then what do you do when you read? What do I do when I read? What do you do when you read? Part of what you do, of course, is you understand, and part of what you do is associate and some other things. But also what you do when you talk about reading is you make mistakes. You mistake, you misprision. Misprision is the term we use in literary criticism. But misprision or erroneous readings, or you know how your mind wanders off and kind of gathers some stuff and comes back? That's part of reading too. You can't say that reading is purely decoding. It is the human mind, and we wander. We wander around. We associate. We gather stuff. So when we're reading, and when we're reading loaded kinds of documents, we do the wandering. So I want to bring that back too. So let's start out with fractals. Let me see where I'm going here, if this does it. Okay, here's just a definition of fractals, which is in mathematics, a fractal is an abstract object, and this is used to describe and simulate naturally occurring objects. Artificially created fractals commonly exhibit similar patterns at increasingly small scales. It is also known as expanding symmetry or evolving symmetry, or sometimes it's called zoomable. You zoom in on it, and I'll show you some examples of it. You'll zoom in on it, and it is the same at every scale, all the way out, all the way in. And you'll see some of the examples that zoomability, that sense of is important. If replication is exactly the same at every scale, it's called self-similar. And self-similar fractals are the ones that are often end up on in art galleries, self-similar, and you'll see what that means. One of the things mathematicians have called it is the fingerprints of God. That this is inevitably there, the fingerprints of God. This is stuff that we know. This is I think Einstein said that God does not play at dice with the universe, and that there is a master elegance, a master set of connections to it. And fractals have something to do with this in the sense that they are predictable scales that we can look for. Okay. You are getting very sleepy. You are getting very sleepy. Leave your wallet on the floor next to your seat. This is a fractal being generated here. I especially like the orange and blue, and when I look at this, I kind of get hypnotized. So this is a fractal in the generative sense. Let's look at something that's we can watch. See that surface on it at the end. That's the fractal surface being generated. Here's one that's going to hold still for you. If you keep zooming in on this, it continually is the same all the way in. Here's a fractal in nature. Now, technically, Fibonacci numbers and fractals are not the same thing, but they have the same associative process. They are, and this is more technically Fibonacci. This is a chambered nautilus cut in half. And you see that there's a growth, and we'll talk a little bit about those Fibonacci numbers, but it is that patterning, that sequential patterning, that is the same at scale as it comes out. And this is available in nature in a number of ways. Here's a couple of them. This is again Fibonacci numbers, and here's what Fibonacci numbers are. Fibonacci numbers go back to the 12th century. Fibonacci, 13th century, I guess he is. 13th century Fibonacci is an observation that if you take 0, 1, if you take the number system and start adding them together, 0 and 1 are 1. Now take the next two numbers. 1 and 1 are 2. Take the next two numbers. 2 and 1 are 3. Okay, it's kind of a game. 3 and 1, 5. 5 and 3, 8. All right? It's interesting, Fibonacci numbers. And Fibonacci is also called a Lucas set, in which instead of starting with 0, you start with 2. 2 and 0 are 2. All right? 2 and 0 are 2. And then you keep adding them up, and you just get a different sequential, but a sequence also built in, like these fractals are going to be, that are repetitive, reiterative, and you can zoom in, and they go on forever. So Fibonacci numbers are this, are the obvious thing. These are, you can just keep adding up the last two numbers, okay? But if instead of start with 0, you start with 2, and then those are called Lucas sets, or 3, or 7, or 28. And you put them in, and you get these reiterative combinations. Again, this is the business that set off my book, that set off the pieces of the book, and the assembly that was required for the book called Some Assembly Required. Okay, this is bacteria. I think this is either bacteria or pollen. Anybody have a guess on that one? Yeah, it looks like pollen, doesn't it? Yeah. Anybody with an allergy? Yeah. And another form of the Fibonacci of the reiteration in this I. Now, if you do the math, you write out the math, this, remember, it's the same at scale. If you were to zoom in, it's the same all the way in. Now, the interesting part is that the design itself is a function of whatever numbers you plug into the system to set it off in the first place. Then that will reiterate itself. The colors, on the other hand, the art part, is somebody else putting the colors in certain places, giving the numbers and structures in that set, giving the numbers certain values which are colors. And those colors then make the designs. They make them either interesting to look at or not interesting. So fractal art is a combination of a mathematical formula plus an artist's sense. In this case, we seem to have depth. We seem to be coming and going. It seems to disappear. And that's based on the numbers, based on the colors that are added to it. And the colors added to it make it give it the kind of depth. And here's more depth. This is the same critter. Now color it differently. Make it black and white. It's not so interesting. So the coloring, but you can see as it goes out the top of the spiral, it's the same. It will be the same forever and ever and ever. The numbers set up the circumstances, if you like. I got pretty interested in this because of the business of these. And again, if you take those, do I have a pointer on here? I think I do. Yeah, if you color these tips differently, and you have this wonderful teal that goes back here, and then these yellow and greens that come, and if you color these differently, you get a different effect. And so nature is doing this in some ways. The fingerprints of God, they were there. We discovered this business. It was all there. And here's one that has at least the appearance of a 3D depth, of a depth to it. Right? We can drop in there. Down here, we seem to have something out of a tunnel on a George Lucas movie, out of Star Wars. The tunnels you fly through to drop the bomb on the Death Star. But again, this is a function of coloration. It's a color function, and again, any edge will take you into a thoroughly repetitive version of this. All right? I kind of like this one. And this one, again, look at the coloration on here. The coloration makes all the difference, gives you all the kinds of patterns. You see those all right back there? Is it big enough? Yeah. And you start to think, wait a minute, is this the same stuff we started out with, those same little crenellated edges? And it actually is. And again, you plug your numbers, your number values into the ends in these formulas. And I suggest looking at basically Wikipedia if you'd like. Now this is one of Junpei Sekino's, I think. He liked to do these circles, and again, they are reiterative. They reiterate all the way. This one and the next one. This is another Junpei Sekino. But if you look at these starbursts, this looks like the heavens. Any edge here will give you exactly the same thing. You know, a guy named Mandelbrot. Benoit Mandelbrot claimed actually to make up the word fractal, and there's some discussion whether people didn't know about this before him. But what he was interested in is a map of England. How long is the coastline of England? He wondered. Well, you can look on a map and you can get the coastline of England. But he said, if you look closer, let's zoom in a little closer. Oh, there's little dents in there. There's a bay, but then there's a bay in the bay, and then there's a little river, and there's a little cut in that. And then if you really got down there and crawled on your knees all around England, how long would the coastline of England be? And he came up with this reiterative set of numbers and this formula for doing this. And basically, fractals were born. Some people say they were known of before this. So this and the coastline of England. And this one looks like somebody took the Christmas wrappings, squished them all into a ball, and made them into a perfect orb. Except if you look carefully, see the repetitive patterns, like wallpaper. Every 12, every 18 inches, the pattern begins to repeat, and so you have to lay them in a certain way. So here's this repetitive pattern. And this is one of my favorite Junpei Sekino fractals. But if you notice, the little dragons are down here, and as we come out the tail, here they are, they're getting bigger and bigger, and they're the same thing, and they keep getting, and all of this business is simply a repetition. It's simply an iterative notion. That the thing is what it is already. It's already there. It's waiting for the formula, for the numbers to be plugged in. It's waiting for the coloration. I always thought this one looked like dragons. Now, this is not a fractal. And here's that associative process. This is, of course, DNA, AGCT. That's the four pieces, the assembled pieces. But you look at it and you say, here's another fingerprint, if you like, the fingerprint of God, if you want. The DNA is an iterative process. It's a reiteration. When they first did the human genome, one of the things they discovered is there's a lot of empty slots in there that they don't seem to be doing anything. They've thought about this, and there's some people who say, well, you know, all that stuff is necessary. Even the placeholders are necessary. They called it redundancy, that there's a lot of redundancy in the human gene. Kind of fascinating looking thing, isn't it? And if you look at it, stare at it long enough, it'll turn back in the other direction. When I was building this, I thought, wait a minute, it's going back the other direction. And again, it's not a fractal. Neither technically are the Fibonacci numbers fractals. But look at their associations. They are associative process. And in my mind, they're banging off each other. You know what a Venn diagram is, where the circles come on top of each other and one circle comes over the other? And when you talk about influence of one thing to being the other, those Venn diagrams, well, this is the creative process that these things come together and loop over each other, and pretty soon they begin to highlight parts of each other. And now modernism in art, and you start to say, well, as the Monty Python used to say, and now for something completely different. This is it, but it's not so completely different. This is the one I bring from 40 years of teaching, the notions of modernism and explaining it at various levels and talking about it. One of the things about the modernism is it wants to make it new, Ezra Pound. Just make it new. Skip all of that incredible power of tradition, all that business coming from behind that's coming after us, that's trying to make us make the same thing over and over. You could take this back to Ralph Waldo Emerson if you'd like, but the 20th century really in music, in Schoenberg, and the 12-tone scale, in architecture, in Mies van der Rohe, in attempts to do something new, to turn your back. T.S. Eliot wrote this marvelous piece called Tradition and the Individual Talent. And he talked about when you're a writer and you're writing and you're trying to make something exciting and new, and there's an incredible pressure for him, the 17th century. There's an incredible presence in your life of the things you read and the things you learned about and the things that delighted you. And it's all in there rattling around in your head. Part of what I would like to do with this is to encourage any of you to embrace this process. I can tell you your kids would love it if you sat down with the legal pad on a warm afternoon or a rainy afternoon in Oregon, sat down with a pencil or a pen and started to tell the stories of your tribe. You started to tell those stories, and this whole business, this same associative business is happening. What did we used to do when we were 9, when we were 15? Remember when the kids, when we had to stop the car all the time, when we took trips? If you sat down and wrote that stuff down, you don't need a computer, although that works for saving it. But your kids will love you to have this, to enter into that creative process, because it's there. It's banging around in your head. It's banging these kind of associative process, Venn diagrams, however you want to do that. And I know just from talking to lots of people my age now who have a document from their past. A document that was, typed out on an old typewriter, that was handwritten. I have a friend who likes to write with a pencil, and I said, why do you like with a pencil? It's so damn hard to see afterwards when you have to have it. Anybody has to transcribe it. And he said, I like the drag of it. I like the way it drags on the paper when I write. And so writing is pleasant with a pencil and not so much with a pen. And some people like the computer or whatever it is, but I want to encourage you to, any story you have to tell, any of this associative process, to bang it around. Don't try to tell somebody else's. Don't try to tell some other version. Just leave your kids some kind of sheaf of papers. Anyway, up to you. but it's there. So modernism comes along. Modernism says, make it new. Okay, let's make it like this. And one of the things modernism is fighting is the realism of the previous century. The realism that was Charles Dickens in writing, and that was realistic painters. Thomas Eakins, for example, an American painter, was doing very realistic things. People rowing on the Schuylkill River, and the water dripping off the oar tips into the water. And modernism says, let's make it new. Let's do anything new. But I suspect, and I can make this argument, I make it long, that what happens in the 20th century is surfaces, solid surfaces like this, are suspect because we know now about the molecular. We know we can get underneath there. We know that the world is in some ways fraudulent surfaces. And if we look carefully, solid surfaces are mostly space. And if we look carefully, Freud, at the interior of people, and we're all walking around saying, hi, how are you? We all look so pleasant to each other, but inside we got this tangle of goo going on there. We've got stuff just below the surface, and then stuff sublimated, which is the great modernist word. Sublimated, there's stuff under there we don't even know about rattling around in there, inside us. And so the surfaces of us, and I suspect that modernism, one of its reactions is not just to make it new, but to be realer. To be realer. Remember, painting is being pursued at this point by the big dog, photography. Nobody can be realer than that photograph. Oh my God. That single moment when the fly was sitting there, there's nothing realer than that. And suddenly, like you're at the buggy factory, you're making buggy whips, and you're saying, oh, we're done with buggy whips. You see that thing that just drove by? And in a way, art says, no, the real is not the surface. It's not the haystack in the pretty sun. It's not the afternoon sun off the water. It's what do you feel like? What's genuine? What makes you feel that? And so in modern art, we get this business. We get this is a kind of an emotional construct. What does it look like inside you? I'm a Calvin and Hobbes fan. Maybe some of you are too. Remember Calvin, any Calvin and Hobbes fans? Anyway, he goes into his dream world. He goes into his dream world, and there's the little guys inside his thing sort of making stuff up for his dreams. Here's George Braque. George Braque, really the mastermind, or at least the second mastermind behind Cubism. And I don't mean Picasso as the first. I mean Juan Gris. Gris as the first really person. Cubism is the interesting thing is that there's that table with some fish and bottles on it. But what about all the different ways of viewing that simultaneously? What's the difference? The difference is time. What if we view them all at the same time? What if we view them from above and the side? And then we move them 20 minutes from now. Where do the shadows go? Where do the eyes end up? So Cubism is an attempt to make it new, but Cubism is often, again, after something realer. Cubism is realer than a portrait of your aunt sitting in a nice dress wrinkled in the classical style. At least that's the argument. Now, we're going to get into some isms here. There are lots of isms that make up modernism, and Fauvism is wonderful. Fauve means savage or wild. Say, what if you had that coloring book when you were a kid and your sister said, make the sky blue because that's what skies are and that tree has to be brown. And you said, no, I'm making it this. This looks like, in fact, I'm pretty sure this is pastels. It's pastels on a piece of sandpaper. So you even change the surface, and that pastel then picks it up. But Fauvism or wild, what if we allowed ourselves all the way back to childhood? What if we could go back to childhood? I've recently been playing with a 16-month-old. And there's very little in my life that makes me get on the floor and get back up again and get on the floor and get back up again. And after a while, there's brand new muscles for that, but also brand new kind of brain stuff if you've been down on the floor with 16 months old. And what they're drawing and what they're making. I had a 4-year-old grandchild paint sort of spots and grapes on a picture, and then he handed it to me quickly like this, and it was so wet with watercolors that it made big stripes off of there. It made this beautiful grape arbor. And I thought, How do you participate creatively in that accident? And you do it by saying yes. You do it by assenting. And in some ways, literature and all the arts are built on assent. We have to say yes to little people with hairy feet in the Shire running around, carrying a ring back to Sauron. And I'm reading that business over again now for another reason. We have to say yes. We have to say yes to art. And so this is another way of saying yes. Let me color it differently. Fauvism. Here's Andre Derain. And this is a kind of a series of association. We got a snake, we got a garden. You can't have a snake in a garden. Usually should be two people, but you throw a bunch of people in there, and then Christianity comes raining down out of the cosmos. But the colors are magnificent. That yellow background. Before this, it would have been considered a cartoon or some fraudulent art to convince the world that this is realer, that this is a realer version of what you look at when you look at art. Now, Vorticism is interesting. Vorticism is a reaction. It came out of Russia, I think. And Vorticism comes out of that, the power of cities to change the way we see things, the geometry that we're involved with. And this is the mechanical world, that if we're going to talk about art in the 20th century, the machine has got to be part of it, not the haystack, the machine. And there's this machine from Lewis. This is Robert Henri, 1902, the Ashcan school. He said, and you'll excuse my French on this because it's not my French. He said, you want to. He sent his students out to paint, and he says, you want to paint every lump of horse shit covered with snow. He said, because that's what's out there. That's the real stuff. And he sends them out. A lot of them come back with ash cans. They painted the ash cans right outside the school. And so we get the Ashcan School of Painting with Robert Henri. And this in 1902. And here's another from George Bellows. Factories. Look at these guys. These guys down here are not happy with their existence. But the beauty of it, the beauty of it and the structure and this smoking behemoth there, the reality of the 20th century is in modernism, it doesn't have to be pretty to be art. And of course, that was one of the tenets of art up to that point, that there was some beauty, some proportion, some delight that we would come away with it, that you wanted hanging on your wall. I don't know, do you want this hanging on your wall every day when you walk in? Yeah, I'd probably take it. It's kind of, and here, now we'll go up the other end from just the beginning of the 20th century to Jackson Pollock. And of course, abstract expressionism is, as far as I know, still the only real contribution of American to art, the only real movement. That movement after World War II, and again, an extension of modernism, where Jackson Pollock would do various kinds of things, drizzle it. But my favorite one was he hung balloons in a sort of a barn and full of different colored paints, and he would shoot them out with a .22, and then he and his girlfriend would get naked and roll around in them. And now you got your basic canvas, and that's pretty much shoots the afternoon if you're going to do that. You got to go come back tomorrow when it dries a little bit and dribble some stuff on it. And you get abstract expressionism, which is, again, as far as I know, the unique American contribution to the great isms of art. And of course, Dadaism, back in the turn of the century, that a kind of someone said that modernism comes out of the incredible feeling of emptiness left after World War I, when the machine turns on man, suddenly death at a distance is possible. Suddenly we can kill at a distance, we can set off mustard gas and rip the lungs out of people we can't see, we can drop, shrapnel gets invented, and the incredible loss of hope, if you like, in World War I, that incredible loss of hope produces a kind of reaction. We can't do that again. Let's not do that again. The war to end all wars, etc. And Dadaism sort of opens up the idea of art, that it is, that anti-art, whatever anti-art is art. And it's, what is art? Da, 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 da. It is as sensical, as viable as da, 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 da. And here's Salvador Dali. Excuse the, whoops, right here. This Salvador Dali piece is, you have to excuse the watermark on there. I was stealing off the internet. That isn't in there. But here's a guy holding up the Catholic Church, and up here you got naked ladies jumping around, and with the horse of war, and more naked ladies in the background. You got all kinds of stuff going on. I'm not sure what this is, but Salvador Dali and surrealism. Again, surreal. You can make the case that being surreal is realer, because that's really what's going on in us. We are in the dream world. We are in the world. We manufacture surfaces for ourselves, and so my book is this stuff clattering around in me. And so I wrote this book. It's called Some Assembly Required. And it's about artificial intelligence. Frankenstein or not Frankenstein. Frankenstein, if you've never read the book of Frankenstein, you're missing something they never put in the movies. In the movies, Frankenstein is always making noises. In the book, Mary Shelley has Frankenstein learning English from the Bible, the King James Bible, and from Milton. His language is as prodigious and powerful as his legs are as he runs up the mountains. He's not walking like this. He is a prodigious athlete. I don't know why they continue to do that. Kenneth Branagh notwithstanding, why they continue to make Frankenstein into this dumb AI, this artificial intelligence, this oaf. When in the book, Mary Shelley has him, he has black lips and yellow eyes. He is prodigious in all ways. He is large. He runs up mountains to do various things, and he speaks Miltonic English, beautiful English, powerful English, English that stops people in their tracks. His language is as powerful as the rest of him. So there's Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is a monster. But AI, in fact, always is courting monsters, isn't it? We're always right on the edge of a robot that takes over, the Roomba that sneaks up on you at night. Does your Roomba come get you when it's like a cat, tries to sleep in your bed with you? No, okay, all right. And so I wrote this book. All this stuff comes clattering together in here. And I'll go through just a couple more things. Here's literary modernism. This is, yes, it is Marilyn Monroe reading Joyce's Ulysses. This is when she was married to Arthur Miller, and she's reading not the rest of it. If any of you in here have read Ulysses, you know you get the last 40 pages is your reward. And I think she's jumped right to the last 40 pages here. Not that she would have to struggle with the rest of it, but Joyce had the advantage of having a person could give him money to say, write it whatever you want to. After he wrote his first book of stories called The Dubliners, he had a patron, and Mrs. Weaver gave him all kinds of money to do. And so the next book he wrote, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, becomes more complicated. And then the next one he writes is Ulysses, which we can still read, and I taught that for years and years at the 400 level. It's tricky, but then at the end, last 40 pages, you get Molly Bloom soliloquy, Molly Bloom musing on the loves of her life in enough detail to get it banned in Ireland until the 80s, actually, 1980s, when it was, there were lots of copies around, but it was banned by the church because it was musing, again, in pretty significant detail on the loves of her life. So Joyce then writes one more book, and it's called Thank you. Finnegan's Wake. And Finnegan's Wake is, well, people talk about not reading Finnegan's Wake, but spending 100 hours with it. Because it's talk about decoding. It's a book that is completely circular, that comes back on itself. The beginning sentence hooks up with the last sentence hooks up with the beginning, and it is, if you like, a fractal. Finnegan's Wake. Okay. So Marilyn Monroe. Now, this is a book of mine, and we can come back to this later if we have time, but I'm running out of time here. This is another book. This book I wrote 3 years ago, It was at a publisher. The publisher went under in Chicago. My new publisher picked it up, and now it's being published after the one that I wrote before. And this is the same process. The manuscript from Moby-Dick has been missing since 1855. What if somebody found it? Who would be after it? Under what conditions? And this will be out in March. You can't get this yet. You can read a couple pages if you want on Amazon. This, while I was doing this, a couple Thanksgivings ago, an MG book is middle grade, and middle grade is 8 to 12 years old. And I wrote this book because I started to write it talking to my grandchildren, my 12 and 8-year-old grandchildren. And then they said, why don't you just, and they would sit there next to me and say, but what color is her hair? What is her dress like? And I thought, okay. And I just sat there, and they coaxed me through this, and so I wrote this book, which this will be out in April, something. It's about the length of Charlotte's Web. Charlotte's Web is the great standard for all of this stuff anyway. And then I wrote this book, and I sort of told my publisher, I think I could write the next one, but from a different point of view. Anyway, this one's going to be out in November or something of next year. Anyway, we can come back to these. What I want to talk a little bit about, just briefly now, is the Hearing Voices Network. And I think I said enough about it. What do I got, 5 minutes? Okay, yeah, but I'll just say about AI, that was the final thing. I started to read about artificial intelligence and all the ways. There is all the mechanical ways that it can be helped, the Roombas and the smartphones and your automobile, of course. My children were in Houston and were flooded during Harvey. Their house was fine, their cars were not because they were sitting down lower, and cars dipped in that sewage, that toxic waste of Houston. You got to throw them away. In fact, she had to come up here to Oregon to buy a car because you couldn't find one within 1,000 miles. So there's that mechanical part, and then there's the other part. The part that is meat, that is the experiments in attempting with a thing called CRISPR. I'll just introduce now, CRISPR. The P stands for palindromic. It means fixing, and what you recently read probably today about the Chinese just cloned a monkey, one sort of monkey or another, and did some adjustments on it. Anyway, we'll come back. We'll do some questions after this, and I think that's a good way to round it off. This is what happened in my head when this book got made. I just want to say a couple of things about I have some books if anybody's interested too. I'm giving the ICL discount of 30%, 35%, 33%. Anyway, if anybody's interested in this book. But I just want to say a little bit about hearing voices. I mean, I just started it. And hearing voices, in some ways, anybody who writes and sits down to write every day hears voices. You hear the voices of the characters. You hear the voices of try this direction, try that direction. So this book tries to combine stuff. It's about a guy who's heard voices all his life. Early in his life, he learned not to mention it because of the, quote, shitstorm that everybody came in. Are you going to hurt yourself? Are you going to hurt somebody else, etc.? So he learned to just enjoy them. And his voices were always just sort of pointing stuff out to him, just saying a word here and a word there. I was up at the Historical Society. Oregon Historical Society has a wonderful Christmas author thing. There were 85 authors up there this year. Has anybody ever been up to that? Yeah, pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, and I had this out, and I had a little pile of books out, and I had a little card on top that said, "Do you hear voices?" And a bunch of people came up to me and said, they were almost all psychologists or counselors and people, and say, "Oh yeah, I deal with this all the time. I deal with it's constant in my life, and there are lots of people who hear voices and just don't trust them and just find them amusing." So my hero in here, named Jake, hears voices, but he also is a writer. And then he also goes to a conference on AI and artificial intelligence, and he goes and he can't hear the guy. can't hear him. So he puts his tape recorder on his machine and brings it back up, and suddenly he can hear the guy. And he finds out the guy has invented something that he, by some definitions, and by some algorithms, by some set of instructions, is alive. This thing is alive. By some, and it's sitting there, and so he tries to visit the guy. He finds himself, has anybody been in the animal barn at OSU? Where they have all the animals and the sheep and stuff in there. It's a great place. So I used that for his office. I put the guy's office in the barns of OSU, a little more assembly. And he goes into the animal barn, and he finds the guy's not in his office, but back in the corner in a lucite box is what looks like a bowl of oatmeal. There's a kind of an orange light on it, and he looks at it, and he looks at it, and he looks away, and he said, it moved. Oh, it couldn't have moved. It's like a bowl of gray-green oatmeal. Anyway, it turns out this is the experiment, and the professor calls this Rex, just as a joke, Rex the king, etc. And so starts the story of the combination of this stuff, fractals and DNA and experiments and what is alive and what's dead, and what in the world is the surface of worlds and all the voices, the concatenation of voices below that world. Certainly in religious terms, voices have always informed not only Joan of Arc, but lots of religious figures. And we all hear voices. Again, statistically, there's a bunch of people in here who are saying, yeah, I know. Not my last voice said to me, oh my gosh. And I said, oh my gosh, I haven't said oh my gosh. I was 12 years old. I began working at a trucking company. And my brother and I called it vocabulary lessons. And the word gosh, alas, fled from my vocabulary at the age of 12. And I have not said the oh my gosh. And I thought, who in the hell is that? But I have no idea how this works, but there's a whole bunch of theories about how the multiple voices that we hear work. So that's my book, is a combination of that stuff that ends up with a character and his girlfriend who runs an art gallery, then fractals come in, and Rex, one day, he walks in to see Rex, and Rex is no longer a gray bowl of oatmeal, he has stripes. And if he has stripes, of course, where can it go from there? So it's sci-fi in the sense that Ursula Le Guin, alas, no longer with us, bless her. She was a wonderful lady. I had a chance to have breakfast with her in the Wallowas. Just Ursula Le Guin and me sitting out looking at the Wallowas at an event one time. What a wonderful lady she was. But in the sense that her stuff is science fiction. She never admitted really to science fiction. She thought it was a genre that held you in instead of released you. And she said, I write literature, I write books. And so in that sense, and in the Kurt Vonnegut sense, and if this book is the funniest book I am capable of writing. That's all I can say about it. Okay, let's do some questions. I'm sure there's some questions. I tried to get at that creative process. What is the business? What goes on in your mind? What are the associative process? How does this all work? So anybody have questions? Please jump in. Can I get back up? Oh, she's got one? Yeah, I think you're turned on.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Now I forgot what I was going to say. Does some people say that I mean, I know artists learn technique, and dancers learn a lot of technique. And I forget she was a famous ballet dancer, but she had a whole school, and I saw her company several times, but it's lost in my head somewhere. But anyway, she said that it takes 10 years to develop your back in order to be a ballerina. And in a way, to me, it meant that, because I gave them freedom to do things that they never could do before. And so, of course, things were much more creative, and people could take more risks and pursue something different, or something that they didn't even know they had inside them. I wonder if you could comment about that, maybe. And also, I have an artist friend that says that he keeps doing the same thing over and over again, and then something happens, and he's not sure what it is, but the one that goes a different direction that everything else did, somehow it fit for him. But I've even heard actors say that technique, they start with technique, and then that's somehow the structure. So I wonder if you could comment on those.
I've had the great good luck, like James Joyce, to have a patron. Willamette University was my patron. There was Elmore Leonard, Elmore Leonard. I ran into him, and we had a person we knew in common, and he said, here's the secret, write on company time. I never had to make my novels popular, in the sense that I have a sister who, for example, my new book after this one is called The Moby-Dick Blues. Its original title was The Moby-Dick Murders. And I sent it to my publisher, and the publisher says, you can't do that because it's not a formulaic mystery, and you don't use the word murders in that title without formulaic mystery, or that's just going to, quote unquote, piss off the readers, and they're not going to like it because it doesn't deliver the kind of formula they want. So it became the Moby-Dick Blues, which I think is better anyway. So I've been able to, for all my novels, write the way I thought was interesting. It's almost as if I didn't have to worry about the price tag on it. And I think that is a great luxury. And I know there are a number of people. John Daniels and I were sitting next to each other. John Daniels, a great Oregon writer, spent a whole winter down on the Rogue River, down in by himself, doing a kind of a Thoreau thing. But he said he's always had to write towards a market. And in fact, Ursula Le Guin said all the time that this market-driven writing comes back and bites itself in some significant ways. And so I've always been able to do what I want to. This recursive business where you're going and then you come back and there it is again and then you go on, move on, when you can make an amalgam of that in your writing, and that's what you're writing about, when those two things join each other, and I've done that in here, it makes it, I suppose, a little bit difficult, but there is the correspondence between the technique, the form and the function, between the technique and what's going on. So I like that question because it gets to that business. And the second question was about what? I don't know. Anybody remember? Oh yeah. Well, yeah. Oh yeah, and we're really interested in each other too. It's about artists and artists stealing from each other, about it and being the present, about reading each other, about going along. After a while, as a writer, you get interested in sentences, and I pick up and I read book or I look on Amazon and how many of you read on a Kindle? I'm kind of interested because. Yeah, and by the way, this book is available on Kindles too. You can push on the words you don't know, and they define themselves. You can push the little A+, and the language and the font gets bigger. If books could do that, they would be able to compete with it. But yeah, I believe in Kindles too. It's just easier sometimes if you can just make the print bigger. And writers always talk to their editors and to their publishers about making the prints bigger. But artists, yeah, I mean, and that's why I want to encourage, everybody's got this assembly thing in their brain where you assemble the past, you assemble memories. There's been a lot written. Nabokov on memory, Speak Memory is a wonderful book. How our memories work. That's why I suggest to sit down. You want to find your own, some assembly required. Sit down with a legal pad and just start writing. William Stafford says you just take what comes. There's no such thing as writer's block. He said if you got writer's block and nothing's coming, lower your standards. And all of a sudden, there it is. You lower your standards. William Stafford also was a friend, and because Kim Stafford and I were in graduate school together, his son, and he tells this other story about being at a reading in Iowa. And there was a farmer sitting in the front row, and he read a short poem. And the farmer was sitting there with his Oshkosh by gosh overalls on. And the farmer, he got done reading the poem, and the farmer raised his hand and said, "How long did it take you to write that poem?" And he said, "All my life." Yeah. And that's in a way what books you write at my age. I'll be 75 next month. That it feels like everything is concocted and met and joined and mixed and mushed with each other in order to do this, including all the other artists you run into.
I have one actually. I'm just standing here, but excuse me? Excuse me?
I think they can't hear. I think they can't hear either. But
No, I can hear, but I think we're going to proceed now. Did you? I can't remember if you said is it on company time if you're a writer and that's just about all you do, and you go to work and sit at the desk at 9 in the morning and you quit at 5 regardless? I mean, how does that work? Does something come out of a process like that? Have you done that?
Elmore Leonard wrote for one of the big advertising agencies out of Detroit. And that's when he would write on company time because it was getting the juices going. He was making ads for Pontiacs and Buicks. He had the big Buick account, and he said it was just. And of course, my business too was I taught creative writing. I taught all this business and modernism and literature, and so writing on company time has two edges to it. Yeah.
Well, Michael, you taught a few courses too. And you had lots of students, and you taught me the sandwich principle, which I had a hard time internalizing, but according to Michael, what you should do when you're grading a paper, if you're going to make comments, you sandwich any critical comment between two positive comments. I always thought the thing to do in correcting a student's paper, not correcting it, but in making comments was to tell them what they did wrong. But I don't know that you always wrote on company time.
Well, yeah, I did go home and write too. I did write on company time. I went home and write. I had two girls, and I read to the girls, and I considered that part of that mix. I mean, can you think of all the books? You know what I was raised on? Bookhouse books. Do anybody remember Bookhouse books? They were blue. They came in a long series. They had Robert Louis Stevenson, and they had excerpts from all kinds of things. They had orange writing on the spine. You see them once in a while in these the Bookhouse books. And Bookhouse books, I remember there was a picture in there of it was a German story about if you're not good little children, the boogeyman will come at night. And there was a picture of little children sleeping and a boogeyman with a big knife. The boogeyman will come at night and cut your thumbs off. And I remember this. And I remember this better than all the nice things and happy things. And this is an old German tale. And I thought, oh my God. And so in my family it became a joke, and we always did it in an act. We'd cut your thumbs off. Because it's so awful, it's funny. There's some of that in there too. Yes.
Yeah. My name is David. My parents did two very good things when my brother and I were young. They sent away for the complete volumes of Robert Louis Stevenson and Mark Twain. And whenever I was homesick from school, that's what I read, all of them. And so I've loved reading ever since.
You know what? That would make a great tale. If you sat down, what do you remember of Mark Twain? What do you remember of Stevenson? The Treasure Island, of course. All that pirate stuff and treasure stuff is great. But if you sat down and just started to draw out of that memory, it's thin at first, the memory, but then it gets thicker and thicker with the associations that come with it. there would be somebody probably in your life who would love to have that written down. Encourage you to do that. But was it do you remember the Mark Twain set? Was it the green ones? Okay, because I have, that's been handed down in my family, and it's about 3 feet long on the shelf. The complete Mark Twain, except it's a green cover produced on paper that yellowed badly by this point. Yeah. Sure.
Hi, I'm Jeanette, and as I listened to you, I thought, I'm assuming you have to learn to listen to all those voices in your head and kind of categorize them somehow, or just wait till they bump into each other and put something together. But I was just trying to reflect on that in my life, and I know sometimes my mind thinks about a whole bunch of different things at one time, and somebody had to tell me, now concentrate. Now, what was it you wanted to say? And I have to do that sometimes. Is that a part of the process that you're going through?
Yes, absolutely. Lots of voices going on. And after a while, and you do it at first. I wrote a lot of garbage first. I wrote stuff that I'd read, and I thought, oh, God, where's this going? A guy named Lloyd Reynolds, who was at Reed College for the longest time, taught calligraphy. And he talked about, he said, there's all these letters piled up in your arm. He says, there's A's. The first 100 are really crappy, but you got to get them out. And they go click, and the next one comes down, the next one comes down, and pretty soon you got these great A's. He said, when you get these great A's, start making B's. And there's the crappy ones at first. Practice. But yes, I think that's it. Who has a tolerance for the garbage, let's call it, that gets produced at first until you learn to harness these things and help them talk to each other? I always thought that ADHD, I was probably a little ADHD, except for the D part. At the end, I never felt any disadvantage of it at all. That my mind was all over the place seemed to me in my work and in my life and certainly in my writing, an incredible advantage. I once wrote a play, and I have to tell this story because some of you have seen the 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, the movie. I recommend it. Martin McDonough. Okay, not many people know it. I won't. But I wrote a play, and the characters were saying, me, I want to talk. And you had to say, no, you just talked. This other person hasn't talked in a while. And you had to bring that character in. Okay.
Hi,
Yes.
I'm Karen.
Hi, Karen.
I'm going to tell on myself here, I guess.
Karen, you have a Roomba.
Yes, I do. I love her. Her name's Flora. Flora. Okay. I have on a couple of occasions had the pleasant experience of all of a sudden an idea coming for a poem, and it just seems to flow from my head through my fingers and out onto the paper, and it just is magic. But most of the time, these ideas, you call it talking in your head, I call them ideas, come up when I'm asleep or, partly asleep. And the telling on myself is that I'm too lazy to get up and write them down.
Well, Edison was known to sit and nap, but he would hold a pan. Do you know this story? He would hold the pan, and he knew that just place between sleep and awake was just rich with notions and ideas and inventions. And he would hold the pan in his hand, and then as he fell asleep, he'd drop it, and he would try to access that moment right between the two. And he said this is where a lot of good stuff came from. Yeah, now you can talk to your phone, though. You just whip your phone out and tell it the poem or whatever you were thinking about. You don't have to have one of those little moleskins in the back pocket anymore. You can just whip your phone out and tell it stuff. Yeah, that moment is really interesting. What is that when suddenly that comes? I claim that's assembly. That's the assembly I'm talking about, where all this stuff, the stuff you knew a long time ago, the stuff you knew as a child and stuff you read as a child, and what's going on now and around you and something you saw and a flash of light, and all of that stuff wants to assemble. Again, the world is so full of associations, much fuller of associations than meanings. And the writing act, the creative act, watercolor does the same thing. Any watercolorists in here? You start to watercolor in that, and you say, whoa, what's that? I started to paint a mountain, and now it's not a mountain anymore. It's a really great tree. That's starting to happen here, and it's that accident, that business that's going on in our heads all this time. I mean, we do all kinds of retired people do all kinds of exercises in crossword puzzles and brain teasers and Sudokus and things to keep things functioning in there. But can you also hear all of that business going on in there? All of that business that wants to be. Do you know what? Voice recognition, every one of your computers, I'll bet, has some voice recognition if you go into the programs and look for it. Just talk to it, and all of a sudden it starts to write. There's something about my voice that voice recognition loves, but there's also programs called Dragon and a bunch of them. But most of your computers you can talk to, and it'll write it out for you. Yeah, voice recognition is on if you have a computer that's 5 years old. You can talk to it.
Michael, if it helps you, the brain is most creative when it's tired. And the theory is that, just like you're saying, all the associations are trying to find meaning, and so it works harder.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, you can tire it out with red wine, too. Just two glasses for making friends. One glass is for tiring. Putting a thumb on your flywheel a little bit so your brain works a little bit harder. Yeah, drop the pan. Yeah, it's there. It's every one of you. If nothing else today, if you go away and start and are bothered by the idea that I got a whole bunch of stuff in there that people would love to know, if I wrote it down, if I put it down in some way or another, and access the story of my tribe, of my totemic group, of my people, of my childhood, all that stuff. Yes.
I'm over here.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Michael. It's Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
I was interested in where you got the idea for the Green Man.
Yeah. The Green Man is a book, my first novel is called The Greening of Ben Brown, 2005. A guy named Ray Robinson, as an 8-year-old in western Pennsylvania, took a high voltage. He fell into one of those substations and took some like 400,000 volts or something awful. Most people would be killed by it. He was disfigured and turned green. And he was known in western Pennsylvania. Anybody raised in western Pennsylvania in that age would know about this. And Ray, and I read about this, and again, this was a 2-glass of wine thing. This was in Eugene. A friend was talking about this. She said her brother, they used to get a bunch of people together in the cars, and they would go rock the Green Man. They would throw rocks at his house till he came out. And apparently he was a nice guy, and it was sort of a monster. Here's a monster, and they would scare their girlfriends, and then they would go off and make out. And apparently, western Pennsylvania was a form of entertainment in western Pennsylvania. And I heard about this, and that's all I knew. And I picked him up, and I made him a lot greener than he actually was. And I brought him to Oregon, and I made him sensitive to the chemicals of Hua-Chang and to the herbicides and sprays and things. And so he becomes the canary in the mine. And anyway, in any small town, if somebody green moves in, all the weird people out on the edge of that bell curve are not weird anymore, because the Green Man is the weirdest one, and his name is Ben Brown. So one of the heroes in town is the gas station guy who comes up to him and says, "How you doing, Mr. Brown?" Because everybody else wants to say obviously, Mr. Green, Mr. Brown, Mr. Green. Anyway, that's where that story came from. It's based on a true story in that sense. Yes?
Hi, my name is Franca. Writing is not my biggest problem. I've written, for a few years. And I wrote my first nonfiction recently, and publishing is the hard part. I know this is nuts and bolts question, but
No,
it is, and they said you can't go to a publisher, you have to have a literary agent. Well, good luck with that. So that's my biggest problem right now, is that, I have a good story, I stand by it, and as far as ideas, you wanted the dynamic or a metaphor or something for ideas, is that my ideas, and I have a list, to me, I've told this to other people, so this is not weird. They circle my brain like airplanes that are trying to come in for a landing, and they will circle until I make them come in for a landing. So it's not like I say I don't have a choice in writing. I'm going to have to write. But getting the publishing part for just this one fiction, my only fiction, that's become a Herculean task.
Yeah, I don't have an agent. Nobody is interested in an agent when somebody starts writing novels in their 50s or 60s. I have a daughter who started in her 30s. Her first novel is coming out, by the way, in April, in March, on March 13th. She has an agent. She is probably the best agent in the United States. Anyway, you can look for her, Emily Strelo. She'll be reading all up and down the coast. But part of it is age. Part of it just is age. I mean, I've got successful novels and everything, and nobody wants a 75-year-old, and no agent does it. So you learn to be your own agent. Nuts and bolts. Learn to be your own agent. Look on the internet. Look at submissions. What submissions are required? Go through. If they want it in 12-point times Roman, give it to them in 12 points times Roman. They want to see if you can follow the instructions. What kind of things have you done? What are your plans? What are your plans for promoting this work? How savvy are you about social networking? Do you have a Facebook page? Do you have Instagram? Those are the main ones, but then there's Pinterest and the other stuff. Find out about that stuff. It's easy to do. You can be your own agent. And look at publishers. You look up publishers, and they're not going to be the top 5. The top 5 are conglomerates anyway. They're usually owned by German or French people. All that Knopf and Scribners and all that stuff is now, they're all conglomerates. They're giant conglomerates that have with them all kinds of other subsidy publishings hooked onto them. But there are all kinds of publishers. And if you've got something done, come up to me afterwards and I'll tell you one place you might start with it. Yes?
My name's Ken. No question, just a comment. The in-between wakefulness and sleep thing, I've heard of 2 people that tried that. The first one came up with this great idea, always kept the pad and pencil by his bed, pulled it up, and the next morning when he looked at it, he had written the equivalent of 2 pages, all in one line.
Gotta wake up a tiny bit more.
And the other person I know of wrote Cove-Fee-Fee.
I understand that. But this, I mean, we are marvelous. We're carrying around this marvelous. The computer is to underestimate our brains. Our brains are marvelous by the storage. That's why I say sublimation is one of the great ideas of the 20th century. Because even if the rest of Freud is basically crap, the idea of sublimation, that all this stuff is in there and it's available and it can be stimulated out by bringing it out of childhood in various places. We are all walking giant text creators in all different kinds of ways. And I mean text in the largest sense of painting and poetry and draw that. To lift those particular muscles is, I think, marvelous thing to do at my age.
Someone told me just recently that if you fast, you would be able to think better. And I had trouble believing that. Is there any scientific basis for that when you're after fasting for a while that your brain works better?
I think some people, but I mean, I don't write hungry. If I'm hungry or sort of sugar fluttery, you know, that place, that's not a good place to write from because it's sort of pissed off writing. In the sense, it makes me kind of crabby. Let's call it that. It's a kind of crabby writing. And if you're really well fed, of course, you're sitting there going, oh, that's not any good either. But somewhere in between there, and I recommend caffeine. I mean, the frontal lobes, if you want to kick those frontal lobes out a little bit. And I don't know about fasting. I think after about 3 or 4 days, you might sort of pick up your I have daughters who do this kind of thing, and they try to convince me to do it. And I think exercise is great. one of the things about writing and painting and everything else is as I say in my workshop, sometimes it's a contract you sign between your butt and a chair. And you got to stay there. You got to stay in that chair. It's alone. You're alone, and you're in this place, and you're sitting down. And I'm kind of a physical person, and I can sit for so long, and then I need exercise. I need that exercise, whatever endorphins or stuff that's produced, whatever brain chemistry comes out of that, and lots of authors say the same thing. Not only Hemingway, but John Irving. Did anybody see John Irving when he was here a couple years ago? We ended up drinking beer down at the Phoenix, and he's an ex-wrestler, and he has this whole physical part of it too. So rather than fast, I would exercise. I mean, maybe that's just me and my kinetic world, but I got to stand up, I got to walk around, I got to go out and photograph the birds in the backyard. That movement seems to, and then all of a sudden stuff comes flooding back, and I get back in there and do it. Also, there's a great little restaurant in Jefferson that used to be called the Plantation. And there's a waitress in there from the 1950s. And I go in there and order one iced tea, and she comes and fills it all afternoon and seats people away from me. So she'd become kind of part of my writing process. So people say, what do you do to write? And I say, well, if you can't write sitting in that chair, get another chair. And there's this restaurant down in you know where Jefferson is? You know the Plantation? Yeah. Anyway, there's a nice cafe down there now, too, a brand new cafe on the corner in Jefferson. Fasting. Ooh. Well, I've got some books up here. If anybody wants any books, they're $15 in the stores, and there are still lots of places to get them. You can get them at any of the regular places on the internet if you're interested in this book. But and it's my cost is $10 today if you want to take one away. But again, there are a lot of Kindle readers here too. There's all kinds of Kindles and Nooks and iPads to read on. Nice thing about that is you can read the first 10, 15 pages. See if you want to do this. See if you want to be involved with this crazy stuff that's in there.
Well, Michael, thanks again for what is always entertaining and stimulating, and with a little information as well, by God. Thanks very much for coming.